Greetings, sis. I'm sorry for bothering you, sis. Please, can you hit me up immediately in my DM? I was just in my prayers and meditating when I got connected to you. I sense a lot around you and your love life, which is important. You know about it in time. Hit me up immediately in DM. And very important. My English is not good, but are you saying German folk magic is making omelette? You look like the food critic from Ratatouille. In a good way. What's good? Duh. I found you on YouTube and I love your content. You fair to check out the YouTube King. They are the greatest when it comes to YouTube advertising, and so many content creators use them for growth. I read on your profile you have anxiety. This primal fear relates to a disrupted root chakra and has lots to do with confidence and primal trust. I have anxiety because that was a joke. That's just a slang term. My chakras are alright. What is this slang? You anonymously reported Saxon fascists account for violent extremism. We didn't find any violations. You're not a woman. Your card is too big. I think you don't know anything about Germany. Well then, let's talk about it. A couple of days ago, Ella Harrison, the Polish folk witch, and the red-headed witch came up with the occult tea tag, which is basically a tag that goes out to every member of the witchy or occult online community to talk about just that, being in community with each other online and the benefits and problems that could bring. And before all of this, I actually did plan making a video talking about some of these aspects, so I felt like this tag was like made for me in a way. The discussions currently taking place are very interesting in my opinion, and I'll link a playlist down below in which more people have put their video responses into, so you can check all of those out and kind of get a read of the room on what the community is generally saying about this topic up until now. So this video will be basically my 2 cents on the issue. Now, Ella Harrison, Joanna, and the Red-Headed Witch have prepared some rough prompts that you can orient yourself on while doing this tag to have more specific key aspects to talk about, and I'm going to be using some of them, but I'm going to be ignoring most of them because I already have my own ideas on what I want to do with this tag. Oh yeah, and I also link the Instagram posts where each of these prompts are listed down below. So yeah, let's get started. So one of the first prompts that I'll be using in this video is the general introduction tag, in which I tell everyone like roughly who I am and introduce myself, so everyone watching this video can get sort of a perspective on what position I'm coming from. So for anyone who's new here, I am 𝔖𝔭𝔬𝔢𝔨𝔢𝔫𝔨𝔢𝔐. I make content here on YouTube and also on Instagram and some other platforms where I mainly talk about German folk magic, or more specifically northwestern German folk magic, which is the area of Germany where I'm from. And basically in the past like maybe 5 years, I have been making content about this to educate people on the topic, of course, to combat misinformation about this topic, and to give people who might not have access to some of the resources because language difference, for example, to some information that they might not have had known about otherwise. And yes, I did say that I made content for 5 years, and anyone watching my videos who has been around for a bit longer might be a bit confused because they don't know me for that long, and that's because I actually was a content creator way before anyone here on YouTube or even back on TikTok knows about. I initially started making witchcraft content in about early 2019 on an app called Pagans and Witches Amino. And to those of you who know what this app is, might already feel a shudder going down your spine. And this is the app where I basically got started in making content for the reasons that I just told you. I just wanted to educate people, and also I was looking for a community to connect with. But after a couple of years, all of that fell apart and I started moving on to TikTok in 2021. And the year after that, I also started posting my content over on Instagram. And in the same year, I believe 2022, I also started this YouTube channel, which is crazy that that's almost like 2 years ago now. Wow. Yeah, and last year, the end of spring, beginning of summer period, I also started my Patreon, so I can share more in depth and more content, generally speaking, and actually get some sort of compensation for it. So this is my general timeline of social media platforms that I used and currently use, minus Twitter and Threads, where I basically just shitpost and don't really share any real content. And this is basically the reason why I have a perspective coming into this tag both as a content creator and a content consumer over many years on different platforms, and I've made some observations. For anyone who's interested in also joining some of the apps that I made or make content in and look for the witchy community there, I have some things that you might want to keep in mind, and I'm going to go through each app individually basically and talk about it. Starting off with the first community that I ever joined was the Pagan and Witches community on Amino. And basically, if you don't know what Amino is, it's basically an app which houses many different communities for different topics in it. And of course there was a witch community, as there was always on most apps. And the Pagan and Witches Amino app functioned basically as an app within the greater Amino universe. And within that you could make an account, you could rise up in levels, you could make blog posts and repost other people's blog posts and comment on them. You could chat with other community members, both in private one-on-one chat rooms and in bigger public chat rooms, which were mostly moderated by other community members. And if you wrote very good blog posts on a more consistent basis, they would be featured on the community homepage, basically. When I joined, I somewhat quickly raced through the ranks, and my posts on German folk magic and Germanic paganism became popular, and I got some sort of notoriety within the community. And this led to me being invited into the Germanic paganism chat room, for example, where, of course, as the topic says, was about Germanic paganism. And after a while, there were instances where, for example, fascists would jump into the chat and spew their nonsense, and I would ask the chat host to remove them, but since they didn't really have any real time to actually care for the chat, they made me co-host, meaning that I could basically kick all of the Nazis out myself. So I kind of became the unofficial real host of that chat room. And then later I got invited into something on the app which was called the Cultural Advisory Board, which was made to combat the huge amounts of cultural appropriation and misinformation taking place on that app. There's a bunch of drama that went down on that platform too, because the closer I got to the actual community leaders, the more I found out that they did not really actually care about the community that they were leading, and were basically just in this weird clique that only cared about making themselves and their friends feel great within the community. And I'll probably do another deep dive on this drama that went down over on Patreon. I don't want to bash the app too much because of course you can make really good friends over there. I did, for example, and if you're watching this, you know who you are. Yeah, you just have to think to yourself, is it worth the headaches and the drama? So next up, TikTok. I quickly jumped onto the witch talk niche of TikTok, in which I made again content which was very specific about Northwestern German folk magic. Quite surprisingly, this quickly became my biggest platform. Like, I maybe have 12,000 or 13,000 followers over there. But again, on TikTok that doesn't really mean much, because most of these people are just scrolling through their FYP and following you, and then never being shown your videos again by the algorithm, which again is one of the problems of that site. The algorithm, which punishes you for things that you didn't even know about were bad. And to circumvent that, people have implemented this weird self-censorship talk. So for example, they say unalived instead of death or killed in some of their videos when they talk about topics which entail that. And I mean, I was lucky. Like, try being a death witch on Witch Talk. Like, I don't know how they would manage to do that. So yeah, that irked me. But what also irritated me is that when my videos got pushed to more people, they weren't pushed to my followers, they were pushed to random corners of TikTok, where that incited a lot of weird comments. And they also demonstrated a poor listening comprehension, I feel like. But the same thing can also be said for the following app that I went on after TikTok, which is YouTube. I still remember in some videos, I think it was one of my book reviews, I said that a book was available in both German and English, and I just had the German version on hand. And I still had people in my comments like, oh yeah, it sucks that this book isn't available in English. And I'm like, I mentioned that like maybe 2 or 3 times in the video. So yeah, that's just general problem with social media. I feel like that people don't really have the attention spans to A, listen properly to what the person in the video is saying, and B, to like watch the video the entire way through before making a comment. And funnily enough, the app where I have the least issues with right now is Instagram, which is surprising to me because I've heard a lot of horror stories about Instagram. I mean, I do still get some weird comments and DMs from time to time, but nowhere near in the quantity that I did over on TikTok or even Amino. To summarize, I would say that Amino is good for finding some few friends in your community, but it's problematic because you're basically at the mercy of the leadership board that can just delete your entire account or posts you made just because they feel like it. On TikTok, it's good to get information out to a lot of people, but it's bad in actually reaching the people that it was intended for. And also I made an entire video already on Patreon where I go in depth into my issues with TikTok, so you can give that a watch if you want the juicy details about that. And I'd say that YouTube is good for making educational content, but like any other app, YouTube runs the risk of putting aesthetics over actual information. Like if you have very aesthetic videos, and the same thing is also especially true for Instagram, if you make aesthetic content, that's going to be valued more than making really good informational content, for example. Okay, now let's just jump into more of the other prompts. I already answered a bit about the censorship that the tag mentioned, and I feel like I also censor myself, not because I want to appease some algorithm, but also I want to keep some things a bit more private, and I also don't want to like accidentally dox myself. I never really talked about this, but I might or might not have, if not a stalker, a person who is a bit too consistently obsessed with me in a way that is not really dangerous yet, but quite unnerving. And for example, I wouldn't want them to know basically where my house is. That's also a reason for why I only mention that I practice Northwestern German folk magic and don't specifically pinpoint the exact area in which I live. Which can go either way in a lot of things, because my Northwestern German folk magic is of course highly regional based, and it's not going to be too similar to someone who lives, for example, directly near the coast. There's always this tension between how broad but how specific can I make things, so that people know what area I'm talking about without actually knowing where I live. The tag also asks how we can prevent spiritual grifters from becoming big in our community. And I feel like the question kind of already has its own answer, because we as a community can, of course, work together. We can vet individuals and then share our experiences with them and put this entire thing into a community vetting situation, so that if you have an individual that a lot of other people, for example, had very negative experiences about and then talk about them, you can kind of already gather that this person is perhaps not the best to keep around, for example, or to engage with. Okay, third point of the tag, imposter syndrome and FOMO. Do I get imposter syndrome as a creator? Sometimes I do. I mean, I have phases where I just want to delete all of my content from everywhere and just never show my face on the internet again. But I feel like that's normal as a creator. I heard the Polish 𝔖𝔭𝔬𝔢𝔨𝔢𝔫𝔨𝔢𝔫 talking about that as well. And I mean, I think that comes from imposter syndrome, from the feeling that I'm not good enough, that I don't make my content aesthetic enough, that I don't make my content digestible enough for most people. Especially when I look at other people, like, I don't know, the Witch's Cookery would be a good example, who makes very, very aesthetic videos. And I'm just thinking to myself, well, I might have 2 minutes of B-roll somewhere, and my audio quality isn't as good, and I don't know how to color correct, and my editing skills, generally speaking, are a bit and also I don't have a really nice background to film on. I mean, usually I make videos in that corner, but then you only have my head floating basically in a white void, so I thought that this might be more interesting to look at, but even then it's not really aesthetic, it's just different. So that's where a lot of my imposter syndrome comes from. I don't really have imposter syndrome that much when it comes to the actual information that I share, because I'm quite short in that. But of course, even I don't know everything about Northwestern German folk magic, or even my specific regional folk magic, and there's always more to learn. Besides that, through people sharing their practice online, I also develop my practice quite a bit. I mean, it helps being in exchange with other people, seeing how other people do things. And for example, it was through the internet that I discovered that folk magic was a thing. I mean, I already knew what folk magic technically was because I grew up with it, but I never categorized it in my brain as witchcraft or folk magic. So having people explicitly state that to me really changed the trajectory of my practice. Okay, fourth point, capitalizing of community. All of us who have been in this community for longer have seen instances where outside entities in some way, shape or form have tried or did capitalize off of our community in one way or another, and some ways were more destructive than others. But this is the thing that frequently happens when you have outsiders, especially with a very capitalistic mindset, come in, because they don't see us as a community of people sharing knowledge between each other. They see us as an opportunity to gain more capital. And because of that, their intentions aren't really aligned with our common good, if that makes sense. And I'm specifically thinking about, for example, larger companies targeting us or using the witchy trends, quote unquote, that stem from our community as a gateway to push some of their products. And these products might be harmful. For example, they might include things such as white sage, which are endangered and really prone to other people appropriating them out of Native American cultures. They might sell crystals which are unethically sourced, or they could spread harmful misinformation and stereotypes about our community. So this is always a danger when you have not outsiders coming in, but especially outsiders with a very capitalistic mindset come in. And sometimes these outsiders become very capitalistically minded insiders, which I feel like could be even more dangerous. But speaking of money, paywalled communities, as the tag asks, what are my feelings? They have the opportunity to be great. They have the opportunity to keep all of these very much, as I said, very capital-minded influences outside. Also, they have the ability to keep, for example, the very much dangerous and toxic parts of our community at bay. If you have a paywalled community which centers around Norse paganism, for example, you could be very much in control about who joins that and make other people who might not be really into this topic join the community and mess everything up. On the other end of the deal, these communities have the ability to become very much echo chambers and morph into cults of personality for the individual who is running that community. It really depends on who is behind that. And again, to go back to my point about community vetting, I feel like that could be a good way to kind of prevent people from joining these cults of personality which might have been developed behind paywalls. Okay, moving on to the final point, the conclusions. What would I personally like to see more in this community of? I feel like the biggest point would be people sharing their cultural specific witchcraft knowledge who are actually from that culture or have a really high degree of knowledge about that culture. So I don't want to see any books on, for example, Slavic paganism written by North American authors whose cousin twice removed was Ukrainian and making a bunch of surface level judgments about the entirety of Slavic magic and then making books about that. In this case, I would want to have actual Slavic people who grew up in that culture to make this content. And the same thing can be said for any other cultural group. I don't want to see white people making books and courses about how you practice Yoruba spirituality. Now, I'm not saying that people who originally come from outside of these communities can't have sufficient knowledge about them, but what I am saying is that these people are probably in the minority when compared to the people who actually grew up within these cultures. And I'm seeing kind of a discrepancy between these two groups. Like, it seems to me that when I look at the witchcraft content that's out there, people from outside of these cultures make more content about them and profit more of them than the people who are actually from these cultures, if that makes sense. So I would like to see that ratio change a bit in the coming years. I also feel like we as a community could do a better job at validating each other's practices. Of course, there are caveats to that, but I really feel like we shouldn't be making trends in the way that we do. For example, if you remember, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, there was this like big malachite hype within our community where every witch had to get a malachite crystal and then document their experience. And this trend really felt to me like a fast fashion equivalent to witchcraft. Like, other people might buy a specific kind of boots which are in trend, or what are these really hyped water bottles called right now? I forget. But for example, they are a trend where everybody seems to be getting them and spending a lot of money on them, and I feel like we as witches shouldn't be chasing the rat tail of consumerism that much. So if we could, as a community, validate each other more in the fact that we do not have to buy these things and that we don't really hype these trends up that much, I feel like we could make everything a bit more calm and chill here. Also, drama in our community is huge, which, like, it's really interesting to see LA influencer level of drama taking place amongst witches. There are entire witchcraft creators, I feel like, at this point, just dedicated to stirring the pot. And I don't know how useful that is, generally speaking, for our community. I mean, there are very much individuals who need to be called out for their shitty behavior, but I don't think that it needs to take place in the tone that it does, in the way that it does, and the consistency that it does. So in my opinion, we could do a better job at maybe more criticizing the actions of an individual instead of personally attacking them and everything about them. And then when we ourselves get criticism, I feel like it's important to listen and not immediately double down on everything. And it's okay to admit that you fucked up. And when someone has fucked up, we shouldn't forget that they have fucked up in the first place, but maybe we should allow them a bit more grace, so to say, of course within reason. Like, basically to everything I said, there are a lot of caveats to it, so don't take everything word for word and use your brain. That's the thing that I feel like sums all of this up perfectly. Like, use your brain and common sense. Let's close this off with the point about community members that I look up to. Members of the community that I look up to would be Chaotic Witch Aunt, of course. Also, the Witch's Cookery, the Norse Witch, Ella Harrison, the Polish folk witch especially. And I feel like I could mention so many more, but then this video would probably be twice as long as it already is. Yeah, I think that's enough for now, and we can go on to the Patreon shoutouts. So, shout out to 𝔬𝔬𝔨𝔨𝔫𝔨𝔶𝔨𝔫𝔨𝔫𝔨𝔫𝔨𝔫𝔨, shout out to Christania and Cheyu, and shout out to Brian and Rini. And with that, we come to the end of this video, and I wish you a great rest of your day, and 𝔬𝔬𝔨𝔬𝔬𝔫𝔨𝔶𝔨𝔬𝔨.